I want you to think about something for a second and really try to put yourself in this headspace.
Okay.
Think about how many times you've sat down maybe, at the start of a fresh new year or just on a quiet Sunday evening.
When you're feeling particularly motivated?
Exactly. You're feeling motivated and you've meticulously planned out your life. Like you have mapped out your exact career trajectory for the next 5 years.
Right. Or maybe you've planned out some massive multi-departmental project at work.
Yeah, or honestly, think about a time you even just tried to schedule out a really busy, jam-packed weekend.
Oh, yeah.
You've got the color-coded spreadsheet open, you've set the calendar alerts, you have accounted for every hour, every dependency, the whole 9 yards.
It is a profoundly comforting feeling, isn't it? Like having that pristine timeline just laid out in front of you.
It feels amazing. You feel totally in control. But then I want you to ask yourself, how many times has a completely random, entirely unforeseen event just swooped out of nowhere and blown that entire beautifully color-coded plan to absolute pieces?
Right. A sudden illness or a weird macroeconomic shift?
Or a massive snowstorm?
Yeah.
Or even just a chance encounter that changes your entire career path?
We all share that universal experience, you know. We desperately crave the certainty of the plan, but reality rarely respects our neatly blocked out schedules.
Totally.
We live in this world of complex, intersecting variables, yet we act as if we're writing a script for a movie where we control all the actors.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the truly crazy thing about that cycle is what we do immediately after the plan blows up.
Right.
We just brush ourselves off, sigh, and what do? We write a new plan.
To build a new spreadsheet.
Yes. We are so thoroughly convinced that if we just get a little bit better at predicting the variables, if we just gather a little more data, we can eventually control the outcome.
But today, we're going to look at why that core assumption, the idea that the future is something we can successfully forecast, might be fundamentally, structurally, and even mathematically flawed.
We are doing a deep dive into some truly fascinating source material today. We're exploring excerpts from a broader, very famous work on unpredictability and extreme world-altering events.
And this specific section we are examining is titled brilliantly, How to Look for Bird Poop.
It is a phenomenal title.
It really is, especially for a concept that challenges everything we are taught about progress.
So our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct exactly why humans are so relentlessly obsessed with forecasting our futures.
And why the highly paid so-called experts consistently and almost comically get it wrong.
Right, and how shifting our own personal mindset from trying to predict the future to preparing for serendipity can completely rewire how you navigate your daily life.
What's fascinating here is that the issue isn't just human error, it's the mathematical nature of the universe itself.
And to really ground just how bad humanity is at this, especially in the highest echelons of the corporate world, we need to start with a story from the summer of 1998.
Yes.
So picture a major European-owned financial institution. We are talking about the kind of place where the dress code is aggressively formal.
Very serious.
Right, the managers are very serious. They wear dark blue suits, crisp white shirts, and even on dress-down Fridays, they project an aura of total unyielding control over the financial universe.
These are people whose entire professional identity is tied to the illusion of foresight.
Exactly. And that summer, their specific mandate is to formulate the ultimate corporate holy grail.
The 5-year plan.
The 5-year plan. So to build this massive, supposedly visionary document, 5 of these top-tier managers are flying all over the world.
We're hitting up Barcelona, they're flying to Hong Kong.
Yeah, they are running on pure sleep deprivation and stale airplane coffee, rushing between high-stakes meetings and attending fancy, mandatory corporate opera performances.
Right.
They are exhausting themselves to write down exactly what the world is going to look like in the year 2003 and exactly how their firm will dominate it.
If you step back and look at the actual operational history of that specific firm, the irony is staggering.
Oh, it really is.
The author, who was actually working there at the time and watching these guys in blue suits run themselves ragged, points out that the firm's historical growth had almost never come from top-down centralized foresight.
Right. It had always been incredibly organic and messy.
Exactly. In fact, their absolute most lucrative, dominant department at that very moment hadn't been planned at all.
Not at all.
It didn't exist in the previous 5-year plan.
It was a total accident. It came into existence because of a completely random chance phone call from a customer.
Right.
The customer called up asking for a very specific, incredibly strange customized financial transaction.
And the traders on the floor essentially just looked at each other, figured out how to cobble it together, and realized there was a massive profit margin in this weird bespoke request.
Yeah.
They built a unit around it organically, and that organic unit grew to be the massive engine of the firm.
Top-down planning had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Nothing. Yet here are these 5 managers ignoring that reality, exhausting themselves to dictate the future from the top down.
And the punchline of the story is just, I mean, it's perfect. It's the ultimate cosmic joke on forecasters.
It really is.
They are sitting in these boardrooms trying to have vision for the medium-term future. And then an event happens that was definitely, absolutely not in their meticulously drafted document.
The Russian financial default of 1998.
Exactly. The Russian government defaulted on its domestic debt.
Which triggered a massive cascading meltdown across global financial markets, including Latin American debt markets.
Right.
It was a textbook, highly improbable, massively impactful event that was completely unpredicted by standard financial models.
Yeah. And what happens to our 5 visionary managers with their grand 5-year plan?
Well, the firm usually had a very sticky employment policy.
Right. They prided themselves on retaining their executive talent. Yeah. But the impact of this unpredicted, chaotic event was so severe, so damaging to the firm's positions, that a mere month after they sketched out this grand 1998 plan,
not a single one of those 5 managers was still employed there.
they were entirely wiped out.
Yeah, completely. And, the psychological resilience of our collective epistemic arrogance is just amazing here.
Totally.
Because, as the author notes, without a doubt, the replacements for those 5 fired managers probably sat down in that exact same boardroom, poured a cup of coffee, and immediately started working on the exact same kind of 5-year plan.
We have this incredibly deep-seated need to overestimate our ability to predict.
And a corresponding blind spot where we completely underestimate the role of pure chance.
It really feels like someone trying to meticulously choreograph an elegant ballet in the middle of an active minefield,
That is a perfect visualization.
You can plan your pirouettes and your leaps on a piece of paper all you want, but the shifting, explosive environment beneath your feet is ultimately going to dictate what actually happens to you.
That is the central planner's dilemma in a nutshell.
But hold on, let me put myself in the shoes of someone running a business or even just trying to manage a household budget.
Okay.
If we completely abandon planning, aren't we just wandering aimlessly? Like if a biotech CEO walks into a board meeting and says, hey guys, no plan this year, we're just going to wander around and see what happens.
They are going to get fired by lunch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Surely some level of directed intention is required to achieve anything complex in this world.
You're hitting on the crucial nuance of the material here. It is not an argument for pure lazy nihilism where intention is useless.
Okay, good.
It is an argument about the type of intention you employ. It is the profound difference between trying to dictate the exact linear path of a specific discovery versus creating an open-ended environment where discovery itself becomes highly probable.
Right.
The text leans very heavily into understanding the true nature of serendipity.
Which is a word we use all the time, usually just to mean a happy accident.
Yeah, but its origins are much deeper.
The word serendipity was actually coined by the writer Hugh Walpole, and he pulled it from an old Persian fairy tale called The 3 Princes of Serendip.
Right.
And the defining characteristic of these princes wasn't that they were lucky. It was that they were constantly making discoveries by accident and sagacity of things that you're not deliberately looking for.
The classical model of discovery that we are taught in elementary school is strictly linear and intentional.
Right. Like the textbook says, a brave explorer sets out to find a new trade route to India. He sails west, and he finds a new trade route to India.
But historical reality is much messier. The explorer searches for a new route to India, gets lost, and accidentally bumps into an entirely new continent called America.
Exactly.
Almost everything of true significance in our modern world is the product of that second serendipitous model.
Yeah.
Inventions and breakthroughs simply do not happen on a rigid timetable. You cannot put a group of smart people in a sterile cubicle, hand them a budget, and say, invent a revolutionary new mode of transport by next Tuesday at 4 p.m.
Right. There were no journalists present when the wheel was invented, but we can be incredibly confident that a Stone Age tribal planner didn't commission the wheel with a strict Gantt chart and a deadline.
No, absolutely not.
And the source goes through this amazing, almost overwhelming list of historical examples to prove this point.
Yeah, the philosopher Francis Bacon noted centuries ago that the most important advances are almost always the least predictable ones.
Arthur Koestler wrote an entire book called The Sleepwalkers about this, right?
He did. He analyzed great discoverers, not as clear-eyed visionaries, but as people essentially stumbling around in the dark, bumping into monumental truths without even fully realizing what they were holding.
We have this intense, retrospective tendency to sanitize history.
Oh, we love to sanitize it.
When we write the textbooks, we erase the messy, confusing reality and replace it with a straight, logical line of intentional progress.
We view figures like Copernicus and Galileo as these intentional revolutionaries who set out to destroy the old world order.
But the reality is far more accidental.
The church didn't even take Galileo that seriously at first. His discoveries were a byproduct of tinkering with new lenses, and he just ended up ruffling political feathers.
Even Charles Darwin's initial presentation on evolution, which fundamentally changed our understanding of life, was met with a collective shrug. The president of the Linnean Society at the time literally announced in his annual review that there had been no striking discovery that year.
They couldn't even see the revolution when it was handed to them.
But let's ground this in a really concrete example that everyone listening knows. Alexander Fleming and penicillin.
A classic.
We're taught that he is the great hero who cured bacterial infections.
Yeah.
But how did the actual moment of discovery happen?
Well, he certainly wasn't executing step 4 of a 5-year plan to revolutionize global medicine.
Not at all. He was, quite literally, just cleaning up his remarkably messy laboratory.
Yes, he went on vacation, left a bunch of petri dishes out, and came back to a huge mess. And as he was tossing these contaminated dishes into a cleaning vat, he paused and noticed that on one particular plate, a blob of penicillium mold had accidentally floated in through the window, landed, and created a bacteria-free halo around itself.
He was actively killing the Staphylococcus bacteria.
Now, was he a researcher looking for something? Yes. He had intention. Like Louis Pasteur said, luck favors the prepared.
Right.
But the actual world-altering discovery of antibiotics was pure, unadulterated serendipity. He didn't predict it.
And even after he found it, the world didn't instantly recognize it.
No, it took a while.
The text notes it took a very long time for health officials to realize this mold juice was actually important. Fleming himself actually kind of lost faith in the idea and moved on to other things before it was revived years later by other scientists.
Which perfectly brings us to the title of the piece, How to Look for Bird Poop.
This is my absolute favorite story in the entire source material because it shows the gap between what we think science looks like and what it actually looks like.
It is the ultimate illustration of the concept. It takes place in 1965 at the famous Bell Labs in New Jersey.
We have these two radio astronomers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson.
Right.
And they are setting up this massive, incredibly sophisticated, super sensitive microwave antenna. It's a huge horn-shaped piece of metal.
But they run into a major frustrating problem.
No matter where they point this antenna in the sky, they are picking up this constant, annoying, low-level background hiss.
It sounds like static on a poorly tuned radio station.
And it is driving them crazy because it is ruining their actual experiments.
So they go through the standard troubleshooting process. They check the electrical equipment. They look for radar interference from nearby airports.
They check for urban radio noise from New York City.
Nothing explains the static. And then they notice that a pair of pigeons have been roosting inside the giant horn of the antenna.
So, being logical scientists, they draw a conclusion. The background noise must be caused by a thick, dielectric layer of bird excrement coating the sensitive inside of the dish.
They literally think to themselves, the static is pigeon poop.
So they get brooms, they get cleaning supplies, and they spend hours meticulously scrubbing bird poop out of this giant scientific instrument, fully convinced that once it's clean, their grand problem will be solved.
Right.
But they clean it out, they turn the machine back on, and the hiss is still there.
And it turns out that persistent, annoying hiss that they were trying so desperately to clean away wasn't bird poop at all.
No,
it was the cosmic microwave background radiation. It was the literal physical echo of the birth of the universe.
They accidentally discovered the physical, measurable evidence of the Big Bang.
A cosmological theory that was kind of languishing in obscurity at the time.
And they weren't looking for the origins of the universe at all. They just wanted a quiet antenna.
Yeah.
The text points out the supreme, almost painful irony of how this was reported. There's a quote from the president of Bell Labs later on, puffing at his chest and praising one of the astronomers as a grand Renaissance figure
Mm.
who heroically extended our fragile understanding of creation.
And the author of our text just skewers that, writing Renaissance schmenaissance. The two fellows were looking for bird poop.
It is a hilarious deflation of scientific pomp.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the deeper point the text is making is about the tragic fate of the actual forecasters.
Right.
Because there were people actively trying to predict this. Think about the physicist Ralph Alpher.
Okay.
He had actually done the complex theoretical math. He had written the papers positing the birth of the universe and predicted that this exact background radiation should exist.
He was the one intentionally looking for it.
Yes. But where does he finally find out that his predicted radiation actually exists in the real world?
He opens the New York Times over breakfast and reads that it was just discovered by two guys in New Jersey who were annoyed by pigeons.
Exactly. As the text so eloquently summarizes the human condition regarding discovery, those looking for evidence did not find it, those not looking for it found it, and were hailed as discoverers.
Okay, so if we take all of this, the 1998 bankers, Fleming's messy lab, the pigeon poop, and we accept that specific discoveries are almost always accidental.
Right.
Here is my question. Why can't we just forecast the general trend of discovery?
Ah,
Like, I might not know exactly what the iPhone 20 is going to look like, but I know computing power gets smaller and faster. So why can't a historian or an economist just model that general forward momentum to predict what society will look like in 50 years?
that is the exact logical pivot the source material makes next. And to answer your question, it introduces a truly fascinating logical barrier that proves why even forecasting general trends of human history is impossible.
Okay.
It brings in Sir Karl Popper, who is a massively influential philosopher of science.
Build him up for me, because his theory here is central to everything we're talking about.
Karl Popper was a thinker deeply concerned with how we acquire knowledge, and the author argues that Popper's most significant yet bizarrely least known insight was his devastating rigorous attack on a concept he called historicism.
And historicism, just so we are all on the same page, is essentially the idea that you can predict the future course of human history by analyzing past historical patterns, right?
Yes.
It's the idea that history has a discernible rhythm or a set of laws. It's like predicting the plot of a romantic comedy movie because you've seen 50 other romantic comedies. You know they're going to break up at the end of the second act and run through an airport in the third.
That is a great analogy. People who practice historicism believe society moves in predictable stages.
Right.
Popper hated this idea. He wrote a book dismantling it called The Poverty of Historicism, which he sometimes punningly referred to as the misery of historicism in response to another philosopher.
Interesting.
But Popper's central, logically unassailable argument against predicting historical events rests on a very simple premise. He states that in order to predict the future of historical events, you fundamentally have to predict the future of technological innovation.
Because technology is the primary driver of historical change.
Exactly. The printing press, the steam engine, the atom bomb, these dictate the course of history.
That makes total sense. You can't predict the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century without predicting the invention of the microchip and the internet.
Correct. But here is Popper's trap. Technological innovation is fundamentally, logically unpredictable.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because to prove why you can't predict technology, the text introduces a concept called the law of iterated expectations.
Yes.
And it uses a very visceral, dramatic human example to explain the strong form of this mathematical law. I want everyone listening to imagine this scenario. Let's say you are expecting to find out tomorrow with absolute 100% certainty that your partner has been cheating on you.
It's a dark thought experiment, but stay with it.
Yeah.
If you know for an absolute mathematical fact that you will possess that specific knowledge tomorrow at noon, the law of iterated expectations dictates that you actually functionally possess that knowledge today.
Right. You aren't going to sit around having a pleasant romantic pasta dinner tonight thinking to yourself, well, sure is going to be a bummer tomorrow when I officially learn about the affair.
No.
The expectation of the knowledge collapses into the present. You know it right now. And as the text vividly points out, your behavior changes instantly. You will take action today. You will go into the closet right now, grab a pair of heavy shears, and start cutting all of their expensive Ferragamo ties in half.
The expectation of the event forces the event into the present. Now, apply that strict logical framework to the invention of new technology.
Okay.
The text asks us to imagine a highly intelligent Stone Age tribal planner. This planner is tasked by the tribal chief with forecasting the future development of their society over the next 100 years.
A prehistoric 5-year plan.
Exactly. Now, if this planner is going to do a competent job, they have to project the single most important innovation in human history, the invention of the wheel. Because the wheel will change their agriculture, their warfare, their transport.
But here is the inescapable logical trap the planner falls into. If the tribal planner can accurately and specifically prophesy the invention of the wheel,
It means they already know what a wheel looks like.
they know it's round, they know it needs an axle, they know how the physics of it function, which means...
They already possess the knowledge to build it.
Exactly. The planner hasn't predicted the wheel, they have just invented the wheel.
To accurately predict a specific discovery requires knowing the functional parameters of that discovery, which essentially brings the discovery out of the future and into the present moment.
Right.
Therefore, predicting future technology is a logical paradox. As the author succinctly states, the black swan needs to be predicted. If you can predict the black swan, it's no longer a black swan, it's just a present reality.
And if that's the strong form of the law, the text introduces a weaker form that is equally mind-bending when you really sit with it.
Yeah, the weak form is fascinating.
The text argues that simply to understand the future well enough to forecast its general shape, you have to be able to incorporate elements of that future into your present mental paradigm.
Right.
So imagine you are a highly educated, brilliant scholar sitting in the forecasting department of a medieval university in the year 1200, and your mandate is to project what daily life will look like in the 20th century.
To do that with any degree of accuracy, that medieval scholar wouldn't just have to guess at general progress. They would have to spontaneously imagine concepts that are entirely alien to their reality.
Like what?
They would have to conceptualize the internal combustion engine, the flow of electricity, the physics of an atomic bomb, the invisible architecture of the internet.
It's the stuff they have literally no vocabulary for.
Exactly. But the text goes even further, pointing out they'd have to foresee bizarre, illogical social customs that emerge from that tech. They would have to try and imagine the modern business meeting, where a group of sedentary men sit in a climate-controlled room and voluntarily restrict the blood circulation to their brains by tying a piece of expensive colored cloth tightly around their necks, the necktie.
It's totally absurd. A medieval mind, no matter how brilliant, simply does not possess the conceptual building blocks to even imagine the internet, let alone a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
You are trapped within the vocabulary of your own era.
You really are.
And the text points out that even just knowing that something can be done is often the biggest piece of the puzzle.
That is a critical point. The author mentions how this works in mathematics. Some brilliant mathematician might toil in obscurity for a decade and finally announce they have solved some famously impossible arcane theorem.
Right.
They don't even publish the steps, just the fact that it has been solved. Almost immediately, you will see a sudden cluster of similar proofs pop up from other mathematicians around the world.
It's not that they are plagiarizing the original work.
No, it's that simply knowing a solution is possible breaks a massive mental barrier. The paradigm shifts just by knowing the destination exists.
This creates a terrifyingly hard limit on our ability to forecast. If we could conceive of the tools we will need 50 years from now, those tools would already exist. We are trapped in our present paradigm.
We are.
The author mentions an apocryphal, but deeply resonant story from 1899 about the head of the U.S. Patent Office resigning his post because he honestly believed everything that can be invented has been invented.
Oh, that story.
We sit here in the 21st century and laugh at his chronological arrogance, but the text points out that we commit the exact same fallacy today.
We assume our current vantage point is the apex of understanding.
Exactly, and that we can map the next 50 years of tech based on what we know right now. But we don't know what we don't know.
So this raises an obvious practical dilemma. If we cannot predict what specific tools we will need in the future, and we can't even forecast the general trend of our needs, how do tools actually get made? How does human progress happen at all?
Good question.
The text offers a profound reframe. It argues that engineers and inventors rarely sit down with a blank piece of paper to solve a grand, defined societal problem. Most of the time, they build new tools just for the sheer joy of building.
They do it for the gusto.
They're tinkering.
They are essentially playing. The source describes inventions as solutions waiting for a problem.
Right.
We suffer heavily from what the author calls the silent evidence effect. We look around our modern world and we only see the tools that survived, the ones that changed the world. We assume they were built with grand intention.
What we completely forget, what is silent, are the hundreds of thousands of tools, gadgets, and prototypes that engineers built just to keep themselves busy.
Which accomplished absolutely nothing and were thrown in the trash.
And even the wildly successful tools rarely end up serving the function they were originally built for.
The computer is the perfect example highlighted in the text.
Oh,
When the earliest room-sized computers were being designed, they weren't built with the intention of letting you instantly chat with a high school friend living in Siberia or stream a movie.
they were built for complex ballistic calculations.
Right. But once they existed, they just happened to allow humans to discover entirely new fields of visual geometric mathematics like fractals that absolutely no one was intentionally looking for.
Or look at the internet itself.
Yeah.
The author, who is a writer and essayist, notes with great amusement how the internet allows him to instantly publish his thoughts globally and completely bypass traditional gatekeeping journalists.
But creating a platform for independent essayists was certainly not the goal of the military designers who originally created the ARPANET to maintain communication during a nuclear strike.
The prime, almost poetic illustration in the text is the invention of the laser.
Oh, this is a great one.
Charles Townes, the physicist who invented the laser, didn't have a 5-year plan to revolutionize modern medicine or data storage. He was just a scientist who wanted to figure out how to split light beams. He was satisfying a deeply personal, narrow scientific curiosity.
Right.
And the text notes that when he finally achieved it, his own colleagues actually teased him. They mocked how practically irrelevant his discovery was. It was a neat trick with no immediate commercial application.
It was a toy.
Exactly. But fast forward half a century. The Economist magazine interviewed Townes and asked him if, when he was tinkering with light beams, he had been thinking about the surgical stitching of detached retinas.
He laughed, because of course he hadn't.
Yet today, that toy is the foundation for eyesight correction surgery, for reading barcodes at the grocery store, for compact discs, for transmitting data through fiber optic cables. The solution was invented decades before the problems it eventually solved even existed.
Right, this is blowing my mind, but it also creates a major point of friction for me.
What's that?
If we accept that predicting technology is a logical paradox and that all major inventions are just random toys that eventually find a use, how on earth do modern innovation-dependent industries survive?
That's a fair question.
Like, if I'm a scientist at a pharmaceutical company, I can't just tell my investors, give me $1 billion, I'm going to play with chemicals and wait for serendipity. How does a business function without a rigid roadmap for new products?
It's a very pragmatic question, and the source text actually anticipates it by providing a fantastic real-world example of a company doing exactly this and thriving.
Okay.
The author describes visiting a highly successful biotech firm in California, and the culture of this company completely upended his expectations. They weren't hiding from the reality of unpredictability, they were actively embracing it as their core business model. When the author arrived, he was greeted by executives wearing T-shirts and lapel pins celebrating what they called the Fat Tails Club.
And fat tails is a statistical term, right? It refers to the extreme edges of a bell curve, the highly improbable black swan events that standard models ignore.
Precisely. In finance, a fat tail event usually means a market crash that wipes you out. But this biotech company realized that in research, fat tails can be overwhelmingly positive.
Interesting.
They explicitly designed their entire corporate structure to live off positive black swans.
I love the philosophy of the CEO there. He was a former scientist himself, not just an MBA. And his entire managing philosophy was, let the scientists follow their instincts.
Right.
If a researcher gets curious about a weird reaction to the Petri dish, let them pull that thread. Let them look wherever they want to look. For this company, commercialization wasn't the driver of the research, it was an afterthought.
They deeply understood that biological research is fundamentally irreducibly serendipitous.
Right.
So you don't build a rigid 5-year timeline. You structure the business around the chaotic reality of random discovery.
They train their people to constantly look for what a friend of the author refers to as corners. These are the unintended sideways applications of a drug that completely miss the original target, but solve a different problem entirely. The classic, universally known example cited in the text is Viagra.
Ah, yes.
When Pfizer was originally developing that chemical compound, they were pouring money into creating a drug to treat angina and high blood pressure.
It was supposed to be a heart medication.
Yes, And in clinical trials, it largely failed to do that effectively.
Yeah.
If they had been strictly adhering to a rigid top-down plan, they would have thrown the compound in the trash and fired the research team.
But the researchers noticed that the drug had a very notable, highly specific, unforeseen side effect on the male patients in the trial.
I pivoted.
They embraced the corner, and that failed hypertension drug ended up fundamentally changing the social and sexual mores of retired men globally, generating billions of dollars.
The text also mentions another hypertension drug that entirely failed its primary goal, but accidentally became a massively popular hair growth medication.
So the takeaway here for our own lives isn't to try and predict exactly what discovery you're going to make.
Right.
The goal is to systematically increase your surface area for luck. It reminds me of that famous quote from Louis Pasteur, "Luck favors the prepared."
You don't prepare by writing a script for the future. You prepare by simply doing a massive amount of tinkering.
Exposing yourself to as many random outcomes and disparate ideas as possible.
And keeping your eyes wide open for the metaphorical bird poop that might actually turn out to be the Big Bang.
That is a brilliant synthesis of the first major hurdle. We've established that predicting human innovation is a logical impossibility.
Right.
But the text doesn't stop there. It goes deeper, moving from logic into the realm of pure physics. It argues that even if we completely remove human beings, innovation, and free will from the equation, there is a hard mathematical limit to predicting the future of even the simplest physical objects.
Okay, let's get into the math, because this section reads like a scientific thriller. The text introduces us to a guy named Henri Poincaré. Who is this? Because the author writes about him with such reverence, making him sound like an absolute titan of thought who has been unfairly overshadowed by history.
And he truly was a titan. Henri Poincaré was a late 19th century French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher.
Okay.
To really understand his impact, the author takes the time to describe him visually, contrasting him with our modern pop culture archetype of a scientific genius.
Right.
When we think of a genius today, we immediately picture Albert Einstein sticking his tongue out at the camera, wild hair, playfully unconventional, a bit of a rebel.
Oh, yeah.
Poincaré was the absolute antithesis of that image.
He's a serious guy.
Very serious. He was a bearded, portly, deeply imposing patrician gentleman of the French Third Republic. He projected an intense, quiet dignity. He belonged to a specific class of highly educated, upper-middle-class French mandarins. He was incredibly prolific, but he wasn't writing dry, impenetrable academic papers. He wrote these brilliant, sweeping philosophical essays that were published as serialized articles for the educated public. They read almost like extemporaneous, passionate speeches.
No.
In fact, he was so confident in his flow of thought that he famously refused to even go back and correct his typos or grammatical errors, feeling it was a pedantic waste of his incredibly valuable time.
The author clearly adores him. He calls Poincaré the truest kind of philosopher of science because his philosophical insights didn't come from sitting in an armchair pondering the universe.
Right.
They came from getting his hands dirty in the actual equations and discovering the hard limits of mathematics itself. And to set the stage, we have to understand the era Poincaré lived in.
It was a very specific time.
It was a time when science, specifically physics, felt completely invincible. The field of celestial mechanics, which is using math to predict the movement of planets and comets, was getting so insanely precise that the general consensus was that the universe was just a giant, predictable clockwork machine.
The belief was, if we can just map the current position of all the pieces, and we know the equations of gravity, we can run the math forward and predict the future perfectly, forever.
It was the peak of scientific hubris. And Poincaré was the singular mind who raised his hand in the middle of this victory lap and said, actually,
Yeah.
no, you are all fundamentally wrong.
And what's crucial here, as the text emphasizes, is that Poincaré didn't invent a better mathematical technique to make better forecasts.
Right.
His monumental contribution was mathematically proving that forecasting itself has a hard, impassable ceiling.
And it all started with a math competition for a king, right?
Yes, a competition to celebrate the birthday of the King of Sweden. A prize was offered for whoever could mathematically prove the long-term stability of the solar system.
Could we prove the planets wouldn't eventually crash into each other?
Right. Poincaré took up the challenge. He wrote a massive, incredibly complex paper on celestial mechanics. The judges were astounded by its brilliance, and he was awarded the prize. But then, a quiet, diligent editor who was preparing the manuscript for publication noticed a tiny anomaly in the math, and flagged it for Poincaré.
And when Poincaré went back to fix what he thought was a minor error, the entire foundation of his procedure collapsed.
When he followed the math of that error to its logical conclusion, it completely flipped his entire finding. He went from writing a paper proving the stable, predictable nature of the solar system to writing a paper mathematically proving its ultimate unpredictability, a concept known as non-integrability.
And he demonstrated this profound unpredictability with something called the three-body problem. Break this down for me, because if I think about two planets, say the Earth and the Sun, orbiting each other in an empty vacuum, we can predict that math really easily, right?
Absolutely. Two massive bodies, interacting solely through their mutual gravitational pull in an isolated system, follow a stable, predictable path. You can plot it out a million years into the future with high precision.
Right.
Poincaré proved that if you introduce just one more element, a third body, into that system, everything breaks down.
So if we add, say, a relatively tiny comet passing through the Earth-Sun system.
Exactly. Add that third body. Initially, because the comet is so small, its gravitational impact on the massive Earth and Sun seems negligible. Your models barely register it. But over time, because the gravitational pulls of all three bodies are constantly interacting, pulling on each other, and feeding those microscopic changes back into the system continuously, the math begins to warp. The tiniest variation in the initial trajectory of that comet, a fraction of a millimeter, will eventually compound.
And doesn't compound linearly.
No, it compounds explosively, eventually causing chaotic, entirely unpredictable changes in the orbits of the massive planets themselves.
The text mentions a drawing by someone named David Cowan that visually represents this scattering effect, and it really helped it click for me.
Oh, the bouncing ball.
Yeah. Imagine a ball bouncing around in a closed box. If the walls are perfectly flat, you can predict the bounces. But if the walls have slight curves, the first bounce might be slightly off your prediction. Just a microscopic angle difference. But because the ball is now on a new trajectory, when it hits the second wall, that microscopic error multiplies. By the third bounce, it multiplies again. The variations compound exponentially with every single interaction until you have absolutely no idea where the ball is.
It is a severe, unforgiving multiplicative effect. This is the bedrock of what would later become known as chaos theory. And the problem is, human intuition is terribly equipped to understand exponential multiplication. We think in straight lines.
We really do.
To illustrate how bad we are at this, the text reminds us of the famous fable of the chessboard.
Well, I love this story. So a man invents the game of chess and presents it to a king. The king is so delighted that he offers the inventor any reward he wants.
Right.
The inventor says, I just want some rice to feed my family. Place one single grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, then 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and just keep doubling it until you reach the 64th square.
And the king laughs, thinking this peasant has asked for a meager bowl of rice.
The king thinks linearly, but the math is exponential. By the time you get halfway across the board, you are dealing with millions of grains.
Exactly.
By the time you reach the 64th square, the amount of rice required mathematically exceeds the total grain reserves of the entire planet. The sheer scale of exponential compounding is invisible to the naked human mind.
Our brains literally cannot process it. And to really drive home how this destroys our ability to predict the physical world, the text introduces an incredible mathematical thought experiment computed by a modern mathematician named Michael Berry. And he didn't use planets or comets. He used the most simple, controlled physical system imaginable. A game of pool. Billiard balls on a table.
It is the perfect closed environment. Plain, simple, observable physical world. There is no messy human free will. There are no bizarre quantum mechanics where things exist in two places at once. There is no Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's just solid, smooth balls interacting on a smooth bounded table.
Okay, so I am standing at the table and I hit the cue ball to break. Computing the outcome of that first impact is relatively easy for a physicist.
Right.
You measure the force of my strike, the exact angle of the cue, the friction coefficient of the felt on the table, the mass of the balls. You crunch the numbers and you can predict exactly where the balls will go after that first crack.
Now, computing the second impact.
Yeah.
Where they bounce off each other or the cushions a second time. It's harder.
The math gets much more complex. You need significantly more precision in your starting data, but it is technically doable. But because of those nonlinear multiplicative effects we just talked about.
The tiny errors compounding exponentially with every bounce.
Exactly. The level of precision required to make an accurate prediction absolutely explodes. The text states that by the time you were trying to calculate the ninth impact of the billiard balls, the precision required is so intense that your mathematical model must factor in the gravitational pull of a 150-pound person standing next to the pool table.
Which is astounding, but it gets so much worse.
Oh, it does.
The compounding error grows so violently that by the time you try to mathematically predict the 56th impact of the billiard ball, just 56 bounces, your starting data must be impossibly precise.
How precise?
To accurately project that 56th bounce, your model must account for the gravitational pull of every single elementary particle in the entire known universe.
Every single atom in existence.
The author specifies that you literally have to factor in the gravitational influence of a single electron sitting at the very edge of the observable universe, 10 billion light years away.
Wow.
Because if you omit that single, unimaginably distant electron from your equation, the multiplicative error will ruin your prediction of the 56th bounce.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of what we're discussing today, this thought experiment absolutely shatters the illusion of forecasting.
It really does.
If a brilliant mathematician, using a supercomputer, cannot accurately predict the 56th bounce of a literal billiard ball on a felt table without modeling the entire cosmos, how on earth can a guy in a blue suit sit in a boardroom and predict the complex, chaotic global economy 5 years from now?
They can't. It is an epistemological farce. And this mathematical wall isn't just theoretical. It was proven in practice by a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz in the 1960s, a story the text also highlights.
Ah, yes.
Lorenz was trying to forecast the weather, running a complex computer model of atmospheric dynamics. One day, he ran a lengthy simulation and got a specific weather pattern as a result. Later, he wanted to examine that sequence again.
So he typed what he thought were the exact same initial input numbers back into the computer.
Right, but the simulation produced a wildly, entirely different weather pattern.
He assumed the computer was broken, right, like a vacuum tube had blown.
Exactly, because computers back then were massive, unreliable machines. But when he investigated, he realized it wasn't a hardware bug. When he re-entered the data, he had rounded off the input number.
Just a little bit.
But he only rounded them off by a tiny, microscopic fraction, something like the 4th decimal place, just to save some typing time. He assumed such a minuscule difference wouldn't matter to the macro-level weather prediction.
But that microscopic rounding error compounded exponentially through the simulation and birthed a totally different future.
This realization is what birthed the famous butterfly effect. The concept that a system is so exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can eventually cause a cascading chain of atmospheric events that results in a hurricane in New York months later.
Okay, I'm tracking with the math, but I have to pause and express a genuine point of confusion here.
What's that?
Because we can predict things. We can predict with absolute pinpoint accuracy exactly where the planet Mars will be in 100 years. NASA can predict a solar eclipse down to the exact second, centuries in advance.
That's true.
So why are massive planets perfectly predictable, but a simple billiard ball on a table or tomorrow's weather completely unpredictable?
It is a great question, and it comes down to distinguishing between different types of systems. It goes back to what Poincaré called dynamical systems.
Okay.
The solar system, over the relatively short cosmic time frames that human beings observe it, behaves like a very simple, isolated system. The planets are incredibly massive, their momentum is huge, they exist in the near vacuum of space, and crucially, they're not constantly bumping into each other.
Right.
But the weather on Earth, the balls on a billiard table, and certainly the human economy, these are intensely, tightly coupled dynamical systems. Everything is crowded together, constantly interacting, constantly exchanging energy.
The trajectory of one variable depends entirely on the trajectory of millions of other variables.
Exactly. The everyday world we live in is simply too much of an interconnected dynamical system to ever allow for long-term mathematical precision.
So, if projecting the movement of perfectly smooth, lifeless billiard balls mathematically breaks down after just 50 bounces because it requires knowing the position of every atom in the universe, what happens when we try to apply these mathematical models to social systems? Systems made up of millions of unpredictable, emotional, irrational human beings.
It crosses the line from difficult into sheer absurdity. And this realization leads the text to discuss the work of Friedrich Hayek, specifically his brilliant 1974 Nobel Prize speech, which he titled The Pretense of Knowledge.
A great speech.
Hayek was an economist, but a very rare breed who spent his life focusing on true uncertainty. And in his Nobel speech, instead of taking a victory lap and celebrating his field, he stood up and basically delivered a blistering critique of his own entire profession.
He used that massive platform to attack what he called scientism. And this is a really important definition. Scientism isn't science. Scientism is a disease of thought. It is the arrogant practice of taking the rigorous, precise tools and equations of the hard sciences, like physics or astronomy, and forcefully, inappropriately applying them to the soft, complex social sciences like economics or sociology.
It's like trying to fix a broken heart using a literal steel wrench. It might be a great tool, but you're using it in completely the wrong domain, and you're just going to cause massive damage.
That is exactly Hayek's critique, and he argued most forcefully against the hubris of the central planner.
Right.
Hayek's core theory was that a single centralized institution, whether that is a government planning committee in the Soviet Union or a corporate executive board in Manhattan, can never, ever aggregate all the necessary localized knowledge required to make accurate forecasts.
The world is too complex. There are too many subtle shifts in local desires, too much tacit knowledge held by individuals. The planner is blind.
But society as a whole, organically interacting through millions of tiny localized decisions, can effortlessly integrate that massive amount of information. As the text puts it, society organically thinks outside the box, while the planner is trapped inside it.
The text frames this entire conflict as a fundamental clash between two diametrically opposed ways of viewing knowledge.
Yes.
On one side, you have Platonic knowledge. This is top-down, formulaic, rigid, and closed-minded. The author playfully calls it nerd knowledge. It's the belief that the world operates according to clean rules written in a textbook.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have a Platonic knowledge. This is bottom-up, open-minded, skeptical, and empirical. It focuses on observing what actually works in the messy real world, regardless of whether there is a neat theory to explain it.
And the author provides a really vivid, relatable analogy about learning a foreign language to illustrate the gap between these two approaches.
Oh, the Serbo-Croatian example.
Right. Imagine two people who both decide they want to learn Serbo-Croatian. The first person represents the Platonic nerd. They will sit alone in a quiet room, buy a massive, dense grammar textbook, read it cover to cover, and try to perfectly memorize all the verb declensions, the noun genders, and the syntactical rules.
They treat the language like a top-down mathematical equation created by a linguistic authority that must be solved.
Exactly. And then you have the aplatonic empiricists. How do they learn? They buy a plane ticket, fly directly to Sarajevo, go to a noisy, crowded bar on the outskirts of town and try to pick up dates.
Huh.
They talk to cab drivers. They order food by pointing. They learn the language organically from the bottom up through trial and error and making a fool of themselves. And they only try to fit the grammatical rules to the language much later, if they ever even bother to.
Because language doesn't exist because some ancient committee wrote a grammar book. The grammar book was written after the fact to codify a messy, evolving language that grew organically from the bottom up.
But try explaining that bottom-up reality to a central planner or a government bureaucrat. They demand neat scientific equations.
Right.
This top-down arrogance isn't new. It goes all the way back to the philosopher Plato himself, which is why it's called Platonicity. The text points out a fascinating historical tidbit.
What's that?
Plato genuinely believed that all humans should be perfectly ambidextrous. Why? Did he have biological evidence? No. He believed it simply because absolute symmetry made sense to his theoretical mathematical mind.
He just assumed.
He thought that favoring a right or left hand was a physical deformation caused by foolish nurses holding babies incorrectly. He projected his top-down aesthetic of elegance directly onto reality, completely ignoring biology.
And that top-down assumption persisted for centuries, until Louis Pasteur finally came along and discovered that molecules themselves have a handedness. They are physically left or right oriented. Asymmetry isn't a mistake, it's fundamentally baked into the architecture of nature.
Meanwhile, while the Platonists were obsessing over perfect theories, the ancient empirics, like the philosopher Sextus Empiricus, were doing the exact opposite.
Right, they were practicing medicine without any grand, overarching theories of the human body. They just tinkered.
They tried different poultices and herbs until they observed something that worked, relying purely on chance observation and trial and error, rather than trying to reason their way to a cure from a textbook.
And the danger of ignoring this empirical bottom-up reality isn't just an academic debate. It costs lives. The text brings up the deeply tragic, infuriating story of Ignaz Semmelweis to prove this.
Semmelweis was a brilliant doctor working in a maternity clinic in Vienna in the mid-19th century. He was observing the data, and he noticed a horrifying trend. Women were dying of childbed fever at a drastically higher rate in the clinic run by doctors than in the clinic run by midwives.
Wow.
He empirically deduced that the doctors who were moving directly from performing autopsies on corpses to delivering babies were transferring some sort of invisible cadaverous particles.
So what did he do?
He instituted a strict policy of having the doctors wash their hands with a chlorinated solution. The death rate immediately plummeted. He had empirical, undeniable proof that hand washing saved lives.
But the medical establishment utterly rejected him. Why? Because his empirical data didn't make sense to their grand Platonic theories of disease at the time.
Right.
They believed disease was caused by miasma or bad air or imbalances in the bodily humors. They didn't know what bacteria was yet. So because Semmelweis couldn't provide a top-down theoretical explanation that fit their textbooks, they ignored his life-saving data.
They mocked him, he was driven out of the hospital, and he eventually died in an asylum, completely unvindicated during his lifetime.
It is a chilling reminder of the blindness of the expert guild. So what does this all mean for the massive institutions that govern our modern lives?
The text makes a really interesting, highly counterintuitive argument here about the nature of free market capitalism. It acknowledges that, yes, massive corporations make terrible, mathematically flawed forecasts all the time, and as a result, they go bankrupt and collapse constantly.
Right?
But the author argues this systemic failure is actually incredibly beneficial for us as everyday consumers.
Wait, how does a massive company going bankrupt help me?
It acts as an unseen subsidy. When a corporation acts on quixotic overconfidence, overinvests billions of dollars in a flawed vision of the future, and goes bust, they lose their shareholders' money.
Okay.
But the infrastructure they built remains. Their wealth effectively gets transferred to the public.
The dot-com boom.
Exactly. The text uses the dot-com boom of the late 90s as the prime example. Telecom companies, high on their own massive flawed forecasts about internet traffic, overinvested billions in laying miles and miles of physical fiber optic cables across the ocean floor.
And then the bubble burst.
When the bubble burst, those telecom companies went bankrupt. The investors were wiped out, but the cables were still sitting there at the bottom of the ocean. And that abandoned infrastructure resulted in incredibly cheap, almost free telephone and high-speed internet access for the rest of us for the next decade.
We literally get to reap the benefits of their absolute incompetence. That's amazing. But the text is very careful to draw a line here. It warns that it is a completely different, highly dangerous story when governments engage in this kind of forecasting.
Because when a government acts on a flawed 5-year plan and builds the wrong infrastructure, it doesn't go quietly out of business and leave the assets for us.
It simply raises taxes and forces the citizens to pay the price for its folly.
The government can enforce its mistakes. And there is one other major institution the text critiques heavily for being completely insulated from the consequences of its bad predictions: tenured academia.
This part is spicy.
The text poses a provocative question.
Yeah.
Why do libertarians who aggressively attack government monopolies rarely go after the monopoly of tenured faculty?
Good point.
Because in the modern academic world, granting a professor tenure means giving them permanent ownership of a specific domain of knowledge. A tenured academic cannot be voted out of office like a bad politician, and they do not go bankrupt and dissolve like a bad business.
This creates a deeply insulated guild system where an entire academic field can completely diverge from objective truth, pushing mathematically flawed theories for decades, totally protected from the real-world, ruinous consequences of those theories.
Which brings us directly and aggressively to the absolute worst offenders in the eyes of the author: neoclassical economists.
Because the ultimate fatal flaw in all of these top-down social science models, the reason they're so dangerous, is the core assumption they must make in order to get their precious math to work.
To model society, they have to assume that human beings are completely, perfectly rational.
And this is where the physics envy becomes truly destructive. If you believe that human beings possess free will, you logically cannot believe in rigid, long-term economic projection. You cannot put a mathematically precise equation on how a free, emotional human will act tomorrow.
Right.
So to solve this problem, neoclassical economists utilize a sweeping, arrogant trick. They conceptually strip human beings of their messy free will and replace it with a theoretical mathematical straitjacket called rationality.
They build all their models on the foundational assumption that every single individual will always act predictably, coherently, and logically to maximize their own economic self-interest.
To make the math tractable, they have to invent rules. And the text explains the core rule of this rational actor theory with something called the apples, oranges, and pears rule of logical coherence.
It goes like this. If a researcher asks me my preferences, and I state clearly that I prefer an apple to an orange, and then they ask again, and I state that I prefer an orange to a pear.
Okay.
If I am the perfectly rational economic robot that their equations require me to be, I absolutely logically cannot later state that I prefer a pear to an apple. It violates the transitive property.
If my choices are circular like that, my behavior cannot be generalized into a neat mathematical equation.
This relentless obsession with mathematical optimization, finding the single optimal economic policy using calculus, was championed in the mid-20th century by famous economists like Paul Samuelson.
He built an entire, massively influential career on this. And the source text is absolutely scathing in its assessment of Samuelson. It argues that his push for optimization essentially degraded economics from a nuanced philosophical study of human behavior into a second-rate engineering problem.
It was entirely driven by that physics envy we discussed. They desperately wanted the crisp, undeniable equations of celestial mechanics, completely ignoring that they were dealing with the chaotic, emotional weather of human beings.
It feels exactly like a Silicon Valley tech bro trying to build a dating app algorithm that assumes humans only choose their partners based on a strict rational spreadsheet of metrics. Okay, we optimize for height, income bracket, and geographic distance.
Right.
It completely laughably ignores the reality of human chemistry, pheromones, shared trauma, or the fact that someone might just be having a bad day and swipe left for no reason. It is a totally sterile way of modeling life.
The text acknowledges that Samuelson was an incredibly intelligent man, but it calls his life's work badly invested intelligence. He was so arrogant about his math that he openly mocked his critics, stating, "Those who can do science, others do methodology."
The profound tragedy, according to the text, is that this kind of mathematical bullying effectively displaced the true nuanced thinkers in the field of economics, people who understood that the map is not the territory.
Thinkers like John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, Benoit Mandelbrot, and a remarkably underappreciated economist named G.L.S. Shackle.
Shackle is a particularly fascinating figure because he introduced a revolutionary concept he called unknowledge. Instead of obsessing over building precise mathematical models of the tiny fraction of things we think we know, Shackle argued we should build systems that acknowledge and accommodate the massive dark ocean of things we do not and cannot know.
And the final, undeniable nail in the coffin of Samuelson's rational actor theory doesn't even come from philosophy. It comes from hard data. Behavioral psychologists actually went out and tested this rationality in the real world.
They ran the experiments. And guess what? The rational model is just plain empirically wrong. Human beings do, on a regular basis, make choices that are the exact equivalent of preferring an apple to an orange to a pear, and a pear to an apple. We're beautifully, fundamentally incoherent.
The psychologists proved that human choices are not fixed equations. They can change dynamically based on incredibly trivial factors, like simply changing the sequence in which the questions are asked.
Or, more troublingly for economic models, our choices are deeply influenced by completely irrelevant, random data points. The text provides the classic, mind-bending example of the anchoring effect.
This one is wild. Walk us through the Manhattan dentist experiment.
It's an incredibly simple setup. A psychologist asks the subject to perform a completely unrelated task, like spinning a wheel of fortune, which lands on a random number. Let's say the wheel lands on 10,000.
Okay.
Immediately after seeing that random number, the psychologist asks the subject to estimate a complex fact they couldn't possibly know for sure.
Yeah.
How many dentists do you think practice in Manhattan?
And what happens?
The subject's estimate will be unconsciously, yet measurably, pulled toward that completely random number they just saw. If the wheel landed on a high number, they guess a high number of dentists. If it landed on a low number, they guess low. Their brain grasps onto the irrelevant number as an anchor to process the uncertainty.
They are swayed by pure randomness. So, if human decision-making has this kind of irrationality and randomness biologically baked into it, the central pillar of economic optimization completely collapses.
Because, as the text concludes, if humans aren't rational, you can no longer produce a general theory of human behavior. And without a general theory, you absolutely cannot write an equation to predict the future.
This raises an important question. If we accept that we cannot mathematically project the future because we aren't rational actors, how do we interpret the past?
Because every forecaster, every economist, every stockbroker relies entirely on analyzing historical data to build their models of the future.
But what if the exact same set of historical data points can logically, mathematically prove two completely opposite futures?
Oh man, this is the section of the text that truly messes with your perception of reality. To understand this, let's revisit a concept the author calls the turkey problem. I want you to visualize a turkey living on a farm.
Okay, I see the turkey.
Every single day, the farmer comes out to the pen and feeds the turkey. Day 1, the turkey is fed. Day 50, fed. Day 100, fed. The turkey, acting like a good statistician, is looking at all this past data, drawing a clear trend line and assuming with increasing confidence that the farmer's daily actions mathematically confirm the turkey's ongoing safety and comfort.
From the turkey's perspective, the data model is incredibly robust. But here's the problem. The farmer is standing on the other side of the fence, looking at the exact same data set.
The farmer sees the turkey getting fatter and fatter every day.
And the farmer draws the conclusion that this data confirms it is almost time to slaughter the turkey for Thanksgiving supper. You have one identical, flawless set of historical observations, resulting in two entirely contradictory predictions of the future.
And the text applies this beyond barnyard animals. It applies it to complex human relationships. Imagine you have a business acquaintance who has been incredibly helpful, excessively polite, and deeply kind to you over the past year.
Right.
You could look at that historical data of their behavior and logically say, this confirms they have genuine, selfless affection for me. But you could also look at that exact same data set and say, this confirms they are a highly calculating, mercenary sociopath who is softening me up and setting the stage to ask for a massive, unreasonable favor next week.
Same past data, divergent futures.
To illustrate how easily our brains get fooled by this graphically, the text asks us to visualize a series of charts, specifically figures 3 through 6.
Imagine figure 3 is just a simple scatter plot. You have a sequence of dots moving diagonally upward across a graph. It could represent a growing bacterial population in a lab, or a company's quarter-over-quarter sales records.
Okay, I see the dots going up.
Now, in figure 4, we try to model the future. We apply a linear model. What do? We literally just take a plastic ruler, line it up with the dots, draw a straight line through them, and project that straight line upward into the empty space of the future.
It feels very clean. It is a unique solution. There's only one straight line you can possibly draw through those dots.
It is entirely instinctual. It's what every junior analyst does on their first day. It's like watching a rookie basketball player who scores 10 points in his first game, 20 points in his second game, and 30 points in his third game. We instinctively draw a straight line and assume he is mathematically on track to score 820 points in game 82.
We love the straight line.
But then the text asks us to expand our imagination. In figure 5, it shows that if you remove the arbitrary constraint of the straight ruler, you can draw a sweeping curve that passes perfectly, flawlessly through all those exact same past data dots, but then drastically, violently dives off a cliff tomorrow. In figure 6, it shows another option. The past data dots could actually just be a tiny segment of a massive oscillating wave that only looks like a straight line when viewed through a short, restricted time window.
The mathematical reality is that if you do not strictly limit yourself to a linear model, there is a literal infinity of complex curves that perfectly mathematically fit the past data but predict wildly, catastrophically different futures.
And this mathematical ambiguity sets the stage for one of the most difficult, mind-bending philosophical puzzles I'd ever encountered. The text brings up philosopher Nelson Goodman's riddle of induction, specifically the concept of the Grue emerald.
We need to walk through this very slowly, because it took me 3 reads to stop my brain from rejecting it. Explain the Grue emerald to me.
It is a brilliant, intentionally frustrating philosophical thought experiment designed to break our reliance on past data. Imagine you are holding a beautiful, flawless emerald. You observed this emerald yesterday, and you noted its color. It is green. You observe it again today, right now, and it is still green.
Okay, I have a green emerald.
Now, you use normal, linear human induction, like the ruler on the graph, to make a prediction. You say, based on my past observations, I conclude that this emerald will be green tomorrow.
That makes perfect logical sense to me.
It does, until Goodman introduces a brand new, completely fabricated property into the universe. He calls this property GRU. GRU. He defines the word GRU as follows. An object is GRU if it appears green to our eyes up until a specific arbitrary date, let's say December 31st, 2026, and then at the stroke of midnight, its physical properties change and it appears blue forever after.
Okay, my brain is starting to hurt, but I'm following the rules of the game. Green until 2026, then blue.
So you are looking at your emerald today in the present moment. You ask yourself, does my past observation of this stone being green confirm the hypothesis that the emerald is fundamentally a green object? Yes, it fits the data perfectly.
Right.
But then you must ask, does my past observation equally confirm the hypothesis that the emerald is a GRU object?
Oh, wow. Yes, it does. Because a GRU object is supposed to look green right now. The past data perfectly equally supports both models.
Precisely. Because the past data flawlessly fits both the green theory and the GRU theory, there is absolutely no purely logical, mathematical way to prove, using only the past data, which future will actually happen. The data is entirely neutral.
We only choose to predict the green future because it is a simpler linear story. We reject GRU not because it violates the data, but because it violates our preference for simple narratives.
The text brilliantly links this to what it calls the narrative fallacy. We exist in a universe filled with an absolute infinity of complex stories and curves that can logically explain what we've seen in the past. But our brains are biologically hardwired to hate complexity.
So we just blindly grab the straight ruler, we pick the simplest linear story, and trick ourselves into believing it is the only mathematical truth.
And this realization is why the author is so relentlessly, brutally critical of standard statistical measures, particularly a metric called R-square.
Break down R-square for us, because economists use it like a shield to defend their forecasts.
Simply put, R-square is a statistical tool used to measure how closely a mathematical model aligns with historical data. It's like drawing a tight circle around all the past dots on your graph. If your model perfectly traces the history of the dots, you get a very high R-square. You can have a model with a near-perfect R-square that beautifully, flawlessly maps the entire history of the farmer feeding the turkey.
But as the author points out, a high R-square is completely, utterly unfit for forecasting a world of extremes, a world he calls extremistan. Because mapping the turkey's past tells you absolutely nothing about the Black Swan event of the butcher sharpening his knife in the barn. A high R-square just means you are really, really good at predicting the past.
The text makes a biting joke that having a high R-square is only useful for getting a promotion in an academic economics department. It is entirely useless for surviving reality.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize the sheer amount of destruction we have just leveled against the concept of planning. We have established that predicting the future of technology is logically impossible because of the law of iterated expectations. You'd have to invent the future today.
Right.
We've shown that predicting complex physical systems is mathematically impossible because of chaos theory, exponential compounding, and the three-body problem. We've seen that predicting the economy is psychologically flawed because humans are irrational, anchoring-prone messes.
And finally, we've demonstrated that trying to derive the future from past data is philosophically unsound because of the riddle of induction and the GRU emerald.
It is a comprehensive, multidisciplinary dismantling of the entire forecasting industry.
Which leaves me, and probably everyone listening, with one massive, glaring, unavoidable question. If we are so fundamentally, structurally, and mathematically terrible at predicting the future, why on earth are we so universally, desperately obsessed with doing it?
Why do we pay billions of dollars to Wall Street analysts? Why did those 5 bank managers subject themselves to sleep deprivation just to write a completely useless document?
To answer that ultimate question, the source text pivots away from math and turns to evolutionary biology. Specifically, it highlights the theories of a philosopher named Daniel Dennett. The answer is that the drive to plan isn't just some silly quirk of modern corporate culture. It is deeply, biologically hardwired into the architecture of human consciousness.
Our brains function at their core as anticipation machines.
Explain that. How does anticipation define consciousness?
Dennett argues that the single most potent defining use of human consciousness is our ability to play the counterfactual game in our heads. It is the ability to hit pause on reality, project a scenario into the future, and ask, what if? You think to yourself, if I punch that large angry man in the nose, he's going to punch me back much harder, or perhaps call his lawyer and sue me.
So you simulate the future to avoid a bad outcome.
Exactly. Think about how primitive organisms evolve. They evolve through brutal first-order natural selection. An organism blindly tries a new behavior. If it's a fatal mistake, the organism simply dies, and that specific genetic trait is physically removed from the gene pool. It is a slow, incredibly deadly process of learning.
But human consciousness allows us to cheat the brutal rules of evolution. We don't have to physically die to learn a lesson. We can run the simulation safely inside our heads.
As the philosopher Karl Popper famously put it, our mental projections allow our conjectures to die in our stead.
Wow, we project into the future so that we don't literally walk off a cliff. Evolution put us on a long leash, freeing us from having to rely purely on instinctual, knee-jerk reactions to our immediate physical environment. We can plan for the winter. So this anticipatory machinery was a massive species-defining evolutionary advantage when we were wandering the savannah trying not to get eaten.
It was the key to our survival. But it also beautifully explains why we so easily fall prey to modern experts and forecasters. Human society functions and thrives on the division of knowledge. We cannot possibly know everything. As the text practically points out, if you have a sudden medical emergency, you don't run to the library and enroll in medical school. You go to a doctor.
The doctor, in turn, goes to a mechanic when her car breaks down. We have a deeply ingrained, highly beneficial natural instinct to defer to specialization and expertise.
But the tragedy, the deep irony of the modern world is that we take this ancient evolutionary instinct, which worked brilliantly for physical survival and division of labor, and we blindly apply it to highly complex, abstract domains where true, predictable expertise might actually be an illusion.
We assume that because a surgeon can reliably fix a broken arm, a guy in a blue suit with an economics degree can reliably predict the global stock market 5 years from now.
We desperately biologically crave certainty, so we project the authority of a hard science onto a chaotic, mathematically unpredictable dynamical system.
We take that long, magnificent evolutionary leash that allowed us to survive the savannah, and we use it to hang ourselves with hubris and scientism in the modern world. The very brain feature that kept your ancestors alive thousands of years ago is the exact same feature that makes you confidently lose your entire life savings based on a linear projection curve that completely fails to see the black swan coming.
What an incredible intellectual journey. Let's do a quick clarifying recap for you listening to tie all these massive concepts together. We started by looking at how the most world-altering discoveries, from penicillin in a messy lab to the cosmic radiation of the Big Bang, are almost always serendipitous, not the result of a neat 5-year plan.
We saw, through the logic of Karl Popper, how predicting technology requires functionally inventing it today. We learned from Henri Poincaré and the mind-bending math of billiard balls that the physical universe simply defies long-term precision.
We explored how human beings are not perfectly rational economic robots, which shatters the foundation of social science modeling. We fell into the philosophical trap of the Grue Emerald, realizing that past data can logically tell infinite conflicting stories about tomorrow.
And finally, we saw that our brains are simply evolutionary anticipation machines, constantly churning out predictions to cheat death, desperately seeking a comforting certainty in a fundamentally, structurally uncertain world.
It is a profound amount of paradigm-shifting information to digest. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked today.
We spend so much of our finite lives consumed by anxiety, trying to meticulously map out our 5-year plans, and stressing out endlessly when things inevitably diverge from our neat little scripts.
But if the universe is mathematically chaotic, if forecasting is a logical illusion, and if the greatest discoveries happen when we are looking for something else entirely, maybe true freedom isn't about getting better at predicting the future.
Maybe the goal shouldn't be tightening our grip.
Maybe it's about building a life that is resilient enough and radically open enough to thrive when the unexpected bird poop finally lands on your antenna. What would your daily life look like? How would your stress levels change if you stopped trying to predict the future and instead started actively optimizing for serendipity?
That is a brilliant, liberating question to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the unpredictable.